Welcome to section 2 in the course on Options Foundation. Now, in this section, we are going to study implied volatility. So what is implied volatility and why is it called implied? And these are some of the things that we'll be looking at in this section. Implied volatility is truly the wild card in options pricing. This is probably the most difficult concept to understand in options pricing. But make no mistake, if you don't get implied volatility right, your option trades are going to blow up on you. So it is absolutely critical you understand how implied volatility works. In the case of a stock, when you study stock volatility, you want to get an idea of how much the stock can move around. What is its ability to move around? But it doesn't really have an impact on your trade. In the options world, it directly impacts your trade. So it's not only critical to understand it, but you have to factor it into your option strategy. So that's what this whole section is going to be focused on. And we're going to start with a recap of what stock volatility means, and we'll go on from there. So in a broad sense, the term volatility is the ability of a stock to move around. And the way volatility is calculated is platforms go back 12 months and then they calculate all the closing prices of the stock. And then it's plotted on a statistical standard deviation graph, and then it calculates what the one standard deviation is. And so you'll generally see a bell curve where 68% of the time the stock is trading within this one standard deviation range. So it could be one standard deviation on the upside and one standard deviation on the downside. So after they calculate this, then we say, okay, IBM has a standard deviation or a volatility of 15%. So if IBM stock is at $200, in general, 15% up or down is its one standard deviation range. So we can say something like 68% of the time, IBM trades between 170 and 230. The 170 and 230 being the plus one standard deviation and minus one standard deviation range. Similarly, they calculate volatility for Apple, Netflix. In fact, every stock's volatility is calculated. And that's what you define as stock volatility. But when it comes to options, we need to know a little bit more, because bear in mind, options have a fixed time period. So it's very important to understand within the next 30 days or within the next 60 days how much this option or this stock is going to move around, because that has a direct impact on the strike prices that you choose. So if Apple's at 400 today, the chances of it hitting 425 are much higher than the chances of it hitting 450. But if IBM was also at 400, what are the chances IBM will hit 425 or 450 or whatever the case might be? This is going to be different for every stock because every stock moves around differently. So because there is a time limit on options, the volatility of the stock has to be factored into the options price. Because as an option seller, you're very concerned, okay, is this stock going to hit the strike price where I'm selling my option? Because that is your primary concern. And if there is a chance, then you want to make sure you're receiving enough premium to take that risk. So that's really the key as to why the volatility is important, because from the point of view of a seller of an option, he wants to make sure that he is being adequately compensated for the risk that he's taking. So the best way to understand implied volatility is we go back to our real estate example. So let's say this $1 million house was in California. And in California, as we all know, real estate market is very volatile. Its standard deviation is 20%. So in an annual range, the price of this house can go anywhere from $800,000 to $1.2 million. And so we priced a 60-day option to buy this house in California. Now, let's say that same or a similar house which is worth $1 million, is now in Mississippi, where the real estate market is very stable. The one standard deviation range is 2.5%. So a one standard deviation range typically would mean that the price of the house would fluctuate between $975,000 and $1,025,000. And let's say we had to price the same 60-day option for this Mississippi house. Do you think these two options are going to be priced the same? Well, intuitively, you know it's not. It cannot be. So if we just looked at our example where the premium was $25,000 for this $1 million house, do you think this house would be in California or would it be in Mississippi? I would argue it would be in Mississippi, because a one standard deviation range in Mississippi is plus or minus 25,000, and so for a 60-day option, I would think the $25,000 premium is a reasonable amount for the risk that a seller might take in Mississippi. However, if you look at the California option, which can fluctuate by as much as $400,000, do you think $25,000 is going to be a reasonable premium for an option seller of this option? I don't think so. I would just intuitively, without any calculations, I would say for a 60-day option in California, I would probably price it somewhere between $50,000 to $70,000. That seems to be the range that would be a reasonable amount to compensate for the risk that you take in the California real estate example. So that's the difference between one stock and another. If you were to price similar things on IBM and Netflix, you'll see that the prices of these options, even though they might be trading at the same price, all other factors remaining the same, the price of a more volatile asset is going to be much more, the option price is going to be much more because it's a much more volatile stock. So what are the implied volatility takeaways? The implied volatility takeaways, there are two of them. The more volatile an asset is, its option prices will be higher. I think this has become clear from our previous examples. The more volatile an asset is, its option prices will be higher because the seller of these options has to be compensated enough because the stock is going to move around so much. So if he sells it at a certain strike price, he needs to be adequately compensated for the risk that he's taking. The second takeaway is, think of what happens if the buyer wanted a 120-day option for the house instead of the 60-day. Now, obviously, this option will be even higher because there's more time and therefore there's more opportunity for this asset to bounce around and hit those prices. So whenever you have more time, you're always going to find option prices much higher, and therefore volatility is going to be higher with more time available, and therefore your option prices are also going to be more because of this factor. So there's two things here. One is the option prices are going to be higher simply because there is more time, and so that's the element of time decay or the element of time there. But because there's more time, the effects of volatility are also going to be magnified. So there's two components that will pump up option prices. If you take a longer term option, there are two things that will pump up option prices. One is the fact that there's more time, and two is if volatility is a factor, and basically there's always going to be volatility. It just depends, whether one is more volatile than the other, but there is always volatility in a stock. There's no stock that has zero volatility. It's not possible. So with more time, you're going to have higher volatility there. So those are the two takeaways. In the next chapter, we are going to see how implied volatility gets calculated into an options price.